Did you know about these 3 terrifying true scary stories? Don't watch these horror stories alone, especially the last one. I've never been the outdoorsy type. The smell of damp soil, the itchy mosquito bites, the endless crunch of twigs underfoot, it's just never been my thing. But my dad? He's the complete opposite. A true wilderness junkie. Every summer, without fail, he'd drag me deep into the woods with his rugged friends to unplug from the world and reconnect with nature. For years, I just went along with it, dreading every second. But by the time I hit sophomore year, I'd had enough. I told him I wasn't going unless I could bring a friend. To my surprise, he actually agreed. So I invited Charles, my classmate, and probably the only person I could tolerate on a trip like this. Now, Charles was one of those guys who actually enjoyed camping. He'd been a Boy Scout, loved hiking, loved building fires, the whole deal. I thought that would make the trip unbearable, but weirdly it helped. At least one of us knew what we were doing. But from the moment we arrived, things started going wrong. One of Dad's friends messed up the reservation, and instead of some quiet forest retreat, we ended up at a cheap, overdeveloped campsite. You know, the tight paved walkways, actual bathrooms, even a kid's playground. My dad looked like he'd been tricked into a theme park. And speaking of theme parks, just beyond the trees looming over the campgrounds was an actual amusement park. Yeah, I'm serious. A whole carnival Ferris wheel. Roller coasters. Flashing lights barely visible through the branches. It was the last thing you'd expect to see next to a campsite. My dad was furious, muttering that this wasn't real camping, and Charles wouldn't stop teasing me about it either. That night, after dinner, Charles and I slipped away under the excuse of organizing our stuff. In truth, he had brought a small metal pipe and some weed stashed in an old mint tin. We thought it'd make the night less miserable. We snuck behind the tree line, lit up, and laughed quietly as the cicadas hummed around us. We came back to the tent later, still whispering about random school drama, too wired to sleep. That's when Charles grinned at me. The kind of grin that always meant trouble. "You want to check out the park?" he said. I thought he was joking. But the more he talked about how easy it'd be to climb one of the coasters, how crazy the view must be from up to the more the idea started to sound exciting. So, sometime after midnight, when everyone was asleep, we grabbed our flashlights and snuck off. The air was still almost unnaturally quiet, except for the distant creak of metal from the ride swaying in the wind. The fence around the amusement park was laughably short. With one quick boost from Charles, we were over. Inside, the whole place was shrouded in shadows, empty and dead. But every now and then, we'd hear the hum of a golf cart passing by a security guard making rounds. It felt like we were in a video game, creeping through the darkness, ducking behind stands, sprinting across open paths when the coast was clear. My heart was racing, but it wasn't just fear, it was thrill. When we reached the roller coaster, it looked enormous up close. We found the narrow metal staircase used for maintenance and started climbing. Each step groaned under our weight, echoing faintly into the night. By the time we reached the top, the view stole my breath. From there, the amusement park stretched out like a black ocean of shapes and shadows. The moonlight glinted off the rails, and for a second, everything felt unreal, even beautiful. Charles pulled out his phone and snapped a quick photo. Then, almost in sync, we decided we'd tempted fate long enough and began the careful descent back down. We had no idea that the real nightmare was waiting for us below. Climbing down that roller coaster felt twice as long as going up. Every creak of the steel steps made my chest tighten, like we were seconds away from being caught. But somehow we made it to the ground without a sound. The park was still eerily still. The air had that heavy, hollow quiet you get in abandoned places, where every noise seems too loud. We started retracing our steps back toward the fence. For some reason, it felt darker now. The moon had shifted behind the clouds, and the glow from the park lights barely reached us anymore. Our flashlights stayed off. We didn't dare draw attention. We were maybe halfway back when we spotted a moving beam of light and a guard in a golf cart doing another patrol. We ducked behind a small snack stand, our hearts thudding so hard it felt like they'd give us away. That's when I saw something. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, the kind that tricks your eyes when you're on edge. But then Charles stiffened beside me and whispered, "Did you see that?" About 30 feet away, in the gap between 2 buildings, someone was crouched low to the ground. Not a guard, not a worker, just someone. The figure wasn't moving at first, but it was turned directly toward us, watching. A chill crept up my spine. I told myself it had to be another security guy checking the area. But there was something wrong. The way he was hunched didn't look natural. Then, without warning, the figure bolted forward. It crossed under a dim streetlight for just a heartbeat, and that's when I saw him clearly. He was a man, but not like any I'd ever seen. His clothes were torn, hanging in filthy strips. He limped as he ran, his movements uneven and jerky, like his body didn't quite work right. But what froze me wasn't that. It was his face. It looked smeared like someone had painted it with something thick and dark. It took my brain a second to process what I was looking at. It was blood. Charles and I just stared, unable to breathe. The man darted between two buildings and vanished into the dark. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then, almost in sync, we turned toward the fence and started moving fast. The guard's cart had passed by now, but the rush of fear gave us tunnel vision. All I could think about was getting out. We ran the rest of the way, ducking behind rides, cutting through empty pathways, checking over our shoulders every few steps. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the groan of metal, the echo of our shoes on the pavement sounded like someone chasing us. When we finally reached the fence, Charles boosted me up so fast I scraped my knee on the top edge. I didn't care. We both dropped down on the other side and just stood there panting, wide-eyed, not saying a word. We didn't laugh like before. There was nothing funny about what we'd seen. That walk back to the tent was the longest 5 minutes of my life. Every crunch of dirt behind us made me think the man had followed. When we got back, we zipped the tent shut and just sat there in silence. Neither of us mentioned the man directly, but we didn't have to. We both knew what we saw. The only explanation we could come up with was that he was some homeless guy who'd snuck into the park to sleep or steal. But deep down, that didn't feel right. Something about his face, his movements wasn't normal. It wasn't human. I told myself I'd forget about it by morning. I was wrong. When sunlight finally filtered through the tent fabric, it felt unreal, like waking up after a nightmare you couldn't shake off. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head. But the look on Charles's face said otherwise. He hadn't slept either. We didn't talk about it. We didn't have to. The silence between us said everything. By mid-morning, things seemed almost normal again. My dad was already cooking breakfast, the smell of bacon filling the campsite. Birds chirped, kids laughed in the distance. It was like the world had reset overnight. We tried to act casual, even joked a bit, pretending we weren't haunted by what we'd seen. Around 10 a.m., one of the park staffers came around, knocking on tents and calling everyone to gather. Something in his tone was different. My dad and his friends followed him toward the main clearing, and Charles and I trailed behind, both uneasy. When the man spoke, his voice was steady but serious. He told us there had been an incident the night before. A man had been found dead stabbed at a lake just a few miles from the campsite. The killer, they said, was still on the loose. Authorities were warning everyone in the surrounding area to be on high alert. Then came the description. White male, late 30s, shirtless, disheveled, possibly bleeding or with blood on his clothes. Charles and I froze. It felt like the world stopped spinning. My stomach twisted and the sound of the forest birds, wind, people talking just faded into a dull hum. We didn't even need to look at each other to know. It was him. The man we saw lurking in the park. The man whose face was smeared with blood. He wasn't a homeless guy. He wasn't some weirdo hiding from the guards. He was a killer. The staff told us to start packing up immediately and leave for safety. My dad grumbled, confused but compliant. Charles and I helped pack in silence, moving like robots. We didn't tell anyone what we'd seen. Not my dad, not the Rangers, not a soul. And I still don't know why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was just the kind of stupidity that comes with being a teenager who doesn't want to get in trouble. But I regret it to this day. I keep thinking if we'd told someone, maybe they would have caught him sooner. Maybe no one else would have gotten hurt. Charles and I stayed friends. We went to college together, even ended up in similar careers. But this is something we never bring up. It's like saying it out loud would make it real again. Sometimes late at night I'll think back to that moment when we were hiding behind that snack shack and the man turned toward us. The way he looked. The silence that followed. And I wonder, if we hadn't stayed hidden, if he'd seen us clearly, would we have ever made it back to that tent alive? It happened in October 2016, right in the middle of that clown hysteria that took over the internet. You remember that time, right? People were spotting creepy clowns everywhere on streets, in parking lots, even outside schools. Half of those stories were fake, people chasing clout online, but some of them weren't. And I think I ran into one of the real ones. I was 16 back then, a junior in high school. Just a regular weekday afternoon. The final bell had rung, and after saying bye to my friends, I hopped on the 6 train heading uptown. Normally it's packed at that hour, but that day the car was weirdly quiet, only a few passengers scattered around. Nothing too strange though. I had my headphones in. music blasting Drake or something, and my focus buried in chemistry flashcards on my phone. Basically, I was completely disconnected from reality. The rumble of the train faded behind the music, and I remember thinking how nice it felt to zone out for a bit. When the train slowed down at 96th Street, muscle memory kicked in. I stood up automatically, not even glancing up from my phone. I'd taken that stop 100 times. I could do it with my eyes closed. But this time, something felt off. As the doors slid open with that familiar ding, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. Someone was standing right in the doorway, blocking it. I lifted my head, ready to mutter a quick excuse. And then my stomach dropped. It wasn't just someone, it was a clown. Full costume, oversized rainbow pants, bright yellow shirt with red suspenders, and shoes so big they looked fake. His face was painted white, a red nose perfectly centered, blue eyebrows drawn high above his real ones. Except the makeup was messy and uneven, like he'd done it in a hurry or didn't care how it looked. But what really threw me was the wig. There wasn't one, just pale skin and thin brown hair slicked. Against his scalp, he didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there blocking my exit. His eyes locked on mine. I froze. My hand clenched around my phone so tight it hurt. The train's doors beeped the warning tone before they closed, and panic hit me like a wave. I had 5 seconds. Instinct kicked in. I stepped forward fast, trying to squeeze past him, but the moment my shoulder brushed his arm, he leaned down, bending low so we were face to face. The movement was too smooth, too deliberate. I saw the paint cracking on his cheeks. The corner of his mouth twitched. That's when I bolted. I pushed past him and sprinted down the platform. For a second, I didn't even look back until I heard footsteps. Fast, unsteady. Follow me. The sound of those footsteps was wrong. They echoed unevenly, like whoever was chasing me didn't quite know how to run. Every step slammed against the concrete, followed by a slight scrape, as if one of his shoes dragged behind the other. I spun my head for just a second, and my blood ran cold. The clown was running after me. He wasn't just walking or trying to scare me, he was chasing me. His limbs jerked in sharp, broken motions, almost puppet-like. The dim fluorescent lights overhead flickered as his shadow stretched across the tiles. For one insane moment, my brain froze. You know when fear hits you so hard your body just won't respond? That's what it felt like. Then I saw something glint in his hand. A knife. Not a toy one. Not a proper, real kitchen knife. Long and shiny under the light. My body snapped into action. I bolted toward the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. I could hear him gaining on me, the slap of those ridiculous clown shoes echoing louder and louder. The 96th Street station is usually quiet, especially around mid-afternoon. That day it felt completely deserted. No one was around, no voices, no footsteps but ours. Just that rhythmic pounding behind me, closing the distance. Halfway up the steps I heard the clown let out this awful wheezing laugh. It wasn't loud, it was soft, almost like he was trying not to draw attention, which somehow made it worse. I burst through the turnstiles and onto the street, gasping for air, sunlight blinding my eyes after the dark tunnels below. I spun around, expecting to see him right behind me, but the stairs were empty. No clown. No movement. Just silence. For a few seconds I just stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped my phone when I called the police. They arrived within minutes. 2 officers went down into the station while one stayed with me, asking for a description. I could barely string the words together. Clown outfit, white face paint, red nose, knife, but the more I said it out loud, the more ridiculous it sounded. When the officers came back up, they said he was gone. Not a trace. I wanted to believe it was over. But something about his eyes, the way he moved it, didn't feel random. Even after I got home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew me, that he was watching me, that somehow, this wasn't just some stranger trying to scare people, it was something else. And when I tried to sleep, every time I closed my eyes, I saw that white painted face leaning toward me in the train doorway, and that faint, wheezing laugh echoing behind it. Even though the police told me I was safe, I didn't believe them. How could I? The image of that clown, his cracked makeup, the sound of his shoes smacking the floor, the glint of that knife was burned into my mind. That night, every creak of my apartment made my pulse race. I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see him standing outside watching me from the street. I barely slept. For the next few days, I refused to take the train. I told my parents I just needed a break from school, pretending to be sick so I wouldn't have to leave the house. When I finally did go back, I avoided the subway completely. I took the bus even though it took twice as long, but that didn't stop the thoughts. What if he followed me? What if he knew where I lived? What if he was waiting for me to let my guard down again? The police never found him. No one matching that description was ever caught or questioned. They told me it was probably just a prank gone wrong, but if you saw what I saw, you'd know there was nothing playful about that man. He didn't move like a prankster. Didn't look like one either. He looked like someone who'd done this before. A few weeks later, I started seeing news reports against stories from other cities, other people, more clown sightings, some fake, some not so fake. One headline mentioned a subway incident 2 boroughs over. Same outfit, same knife, same silent stare. That's when I stopped doubting myself. I never saw him again. But that doesn't mean he's gone. Whenever I'm in a subway station now, I can still feel that tight, heavy pressure in my chest, like someone's standing just behind me, waiting, and sometimes when the doors open, I catch myself hesitating just for a second, wondering if someone will be there, someone wearing face paint, someone waiting to block my way. So if you ever find yourself on an empty train late in the day, and the doors slide open but no one gets in, don't rush out. Take a breath. Look first, because I didn't, and I'll never stop wishing I had. This isn't your typical horror story, but it's one that still haunts me. It began a couple of years after college, when life was just a blur of odd jobs and restless nights. I was taking online classes for a graduate certificate, but honestly, I had too much free time and not enough direction. So like most people desperate for quick money, I lived on Indeed, scrolling through every random gig that might keep me afloat. That's when I stumbled across a listing that didn't make sense. It was a lifeguard position at a hotel a few towns away. Sounds simple enough, right? But the details were off. For starters, the hours were completely backward, 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., not exactly peak swimming time. Then came the part that really made my stomach twist. They specifically wanted someone who didn't speak Spanish. That line stood out like blood on a white shirt. See, I've spoken Spanish my whole life. My mom's Mexican, and the town this hotel was in was mostly Spanish-speaking too. So why would they want someone who couldn't understand the language everyone else around there spoke? The only thing that stopped me from closing the tab was the pay. $30 an hour. That was way above anything I'd been offered before. So I told myself I'd just pretend not to know Spanish. Easy money, right? I sent in my application that night and got a call the next morning. They wanted me in for an interview. No background check, no delay, just, "Can you start this week?" That should have been my first warning. When I arrived at the hotel, it looked perfectly normal. Clean lobby, tiled floors, tropical plants, everything you'd expect. A short, heavyset guy met me at the entrance, grinning wide as if I were an old friend. He introduced himself as Esteban, cracked a few jokes, and led me through the courtyard. But just as I started to relax, another man appeared from around a corner. Tall, sharp eyes. Didn't smile. He looked me over from head to toe before saying something in Spanish. Simple stuff about the weather, but I could tell what he was doing, testing me. I played dumb, gave him a confused smile, and shrugged. For a long second, the air was tense. Then both men laughed like they just shared a private joke. The taller one extended his hand and said, "Just testing you, my friend. I'm Jefe." Something about that moment felt rehearsed, like it wasn't a test but a warning. Jefe walked me through the pool area, explaining my duties in a tone that was too smooth, too careful. I was to guard the pool, collect money from non-guests, and call him directly if anything unusual happened. Then came one last instruction that made the hairs on my arms rise. If anyone showed me a blue wristband, I was to unlock a large building behind the pool they called the pool house and let them inside. No questions asked, no questions answered. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Almost too normal. The pay was great, the pool stayed busy, and I started getting used to the strange hours. Most nights, the same mix of guests and locals would trickle in, handing me cash to swim or hang out by the water. Nothing out of the ordinary until one evening. A man I'd never seen before walked up to the gate. He was built like a tank, broad shoulders, sunglasses even though it was dark out, crisp white shirt. He didn't say a word, just lifted his arm to show me something. A blue wristband. I froze for a second, remembering Jefe's words. If anyone shows you one, unlock the pool house, so I did. I pressed the key into the lock and stepped back as the man walked inside. The door shut behind him, sealing with a heavy metallic click. I waited, listening, but couldn't hear a thing from inside. An hour later, he came out again. No eye contact. Just left. His backpack looked heavier than when he went in. From that day on, things changed. More and more people started flashing those blue wristbands. Some came alone, others in groups. They never stayed long, but the timing was always precise, an hour in, an hour out. Meanwhile, the cash started piling up. People using the pool began paying me extra, way more than the fee I'd been told to collect. When I called Jefe about it, he brushed me off. "Don't worry about that," he said flatly. "People make mistakes." Then he hung up mid-sentence. That was when my stomach dropped. It hit me all at once that this wasn't a pool job. It was a front. The money, the wristbands, the weird hours, it all fit together too perfectly. I couldn't prove it, but deep down I knew. This was money laundering. Maybe worse. From that moment on, I saw everything differently. The pool house behind the one I'd unlocked countless times wasn't some maintenance room or storage area. It was where the real business happened. Illegal gambling, drugs, something darker? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't want to. But the worst part was how quickly I got used to it. The people who showed up with wristbands started recognizing me. They greeted me, laughed, even tipped me. Some started using my name. They acted like I was one of them. I knew what that meant. They trusted me. And the more they did, the harder it became to walk away. I told myself I was just a lifeguard. I wasn't touching the money that went inside the pool house. I wasn't opening those bags. My hands were clean, right? That lie worked until the night everything changed. A kid nearly drowned. I saw him go under from across the pool and dove in without a thought. By the time I pulled him out, his face was pale and his father was screaming. I did CPR until the boy coughed up water and started crying. Everyone clapped, shouting my name, patting my back. It was surreal, like a movie moment. But the next part didn't feel like a movie. It felt like a warning. Later that night, Jefe came down from the hotel himself. He shook my hand and thanked me, his voice softer than I'd ever heard. I didn't realize it until afterward, but the boy I saved was his son. The next evening, when I showed up for my shift, something was different. They were all waiting for me, Jefe, Esteban, and a handful of men I recognized from the wristband crowd. Glasses of wine in hand, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They toasted me for saving the boy. But then, one of them raised his glass again, and this time, he spoke in Spanish. I understood every word. He was toasting the lives they'd ruined, and the fortune they'd made doing it. Everyone laughed, loudly, like it was a celebration. And in that moment, as their laughter echoed across the pool, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was part of it. The next day, my phone rang while I was on duty. It was my mom. Now my mom never called unless it was something serious. So I climbed down from the lifeguard chair and walked over to a quiet corner near the gate to answer. She spoke only Spanish, so naturally, I responded the same way. We talked for a few minutes, nothing important, just the usual check-in. When I hung up and turned around, my heart nearly stopped. Esteban was standing there. He wasn't smiling this time. His eyes were cold, sharp, locked onto me like I'd just broken some unspoken rule. The silence between us stretched until it felt suffocating. Then in a low voice, he asked, "How long have you known Spanish?" My throat went dry. My mind scrambled for something that wouldn't get me killed. I forced a laugh and said, "Oh, just practicing." Trying to learn a few words. He didn't buy it. I could see it in his face. He just kept staring at me, motionless, like he was deciding whether to believe me or end the problem right there. The tension was unbearable. My hands were sweating, my heart pounding so loud I thought he could hear it. After what felt like forever, he just nodded once and said, "Okay." Then he turned and walked away. I stood there frozen, unsure if I should run or pretend nothing happened. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. If I did, it might look like guilt. And if they really knew I spoke Spanish, they knew where I lived. I was trapped. For the rest of that shift, I barely blinked. I watched every door, every movement near the pool. The laughter, the splashing, it all felt like background noise to something much darker humming beneath the surface. A few minutes before my shift ended, Esteban walked up again. He handed me a thick envelope and said, "Come an hour early tomorrow. I have a new opportunity for you." Then he tipped me $200 and left. That was the moment I decided I wasn't coming back. When my shift ended, I left my keys in the locker, grabbed my bag and drove straight home. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror. For months after, I couldn't shake the fear. Every time a car slowed near my house, I thought they'd found me. I avoided that part of town entirely, and the more I thought about it, the more pieces started to click. They weren't just using the pool for money laundering. That pool house was probably the center of their entire operation. The wristbands, the overpayments, and the locked door were all connected. I eventually convinced myself I was just a pawn, someone they could point to if cops ever came asking questions. A clueless lifeguard who didn't speak the language. But sometimes, late at night, I still see Esteban's face in my mind, the way he looked at me that day. He wasn't testing me anymore. He already knew. And in that stare, I realized something I'll never forget. He wasn't debating whether I spoke Spanish. He was deciding whether I'd live long enough to tell anyone that I did.